This is the IBJ podcast for the week of February 24th, 2020, brought to you by the law firm Krieg DeVault. I'm Mason King.
If this city could talk, it would say, hey man, you from Chicago. The land of Fred Hampton and Jean-Baptiste Dusable and better tomorrows. As long as you follow your heart of the city, a love that started at Foster Park and hooping after dark or even in the snow when we couldn't shoot jump shots because of how hard the wind would blow. So we take it to the hole, a la D Rose. If this city could talk, it would say from the concrete we rose, a place of deep souls. Some ball in street clothes, nice with the shot, but in the paint we Debos. And coming from Shaw City, there's a lot they put up on us. But whatever they say, they gon' say you from the corners.
Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. In 356 days, that's February 14th, 2021, Indianapolis will host the NBA All-Star Game. And more accurately, it will host the several days of fan festivities and meetings, parties, public events, and on-court action that make up the NBA All-Star Weekend. And that clip you just heard was a little bit of Chicago love from rapper Common during the All-Star Game intro at the United Center earlier this month. So yeah, sure, there's a game, but make no mistake, this is a multi-day basketball and media industry bonanza. And for the host city, it's an opportunity for invaluable exposure, not just to the TV audience, but to the sponsors, executives, players, and celebrities with the deepest pockets and the most influence in our multimedia-soaked culture. Suffice to say, you do not want to screw it up. Obviously, Indianapolis has plenty of experience with this kind of challenge. You could argue that our downtown has coalesced in the last 4 decades around the ability to host exactly this kind of high-traffic event. The question isn't whether Indianapolis can do a competent job. The question is how the city chooses to present itself over that weekend and how close it can get to the very high bar that it has set for itself and others have set for Indianapolis. Now, by all appearances, Chicago did a pretty phenomenal job with the 2020 All-Star Game. And as the festivities got started, a group of about 36 Indianapolis executives and officials traveled up to Chicago to do their homework. These were members of the Indianapolis Host Committee, Pacer Sports and Entertainment, local sports and tourism groups, various government entities. They studied nearly every aspect of staging the All-Star Game, taking notes on behind-the-scenes preparations and best practices, and IBJ sports reporter Mickey Shuey went up with them to get a sense of their experience and any concerns that might shake loose. He has a story about it in this week's IBJ, and he's joining us today to talk about it.
Thanks for having me, Mason.
So I briefly referred to this, but give us a little better idea. What was your mission in Chicago?
So my mission in Chicago was to get a sense of what the All-Star Game brings to the table for the city that's hosting. There were about 1,200 credentialed media in Chicago for the All-Star Game. There were tens of thousands of fans in town for the events of the weekend, ranging from events on Friday night all the way up to the All-Star Game on Sunday night.
And if you want to compare this to our experience with the Super Bowl, like that's a big stadium. That was 66,000 people. Whereas like in the United Center and in the Fieldhouse for Indianapolis next year, it's more along the lines of like 20,000, but there's still a lot of people who are in town for the game.
You are correct. The Indianapolis Host Committee expects about 100,000 people to be in town for the NBA All-Star Game in 2021. Certainly a lot of people in town and not a lot of people going to the game by comparison to the Super Bowls. So there's going to be a lot of activities just as there was with the Super Bowl, but not as many people going to the game.
Now, before we get too deep into the findings from your trip, I do want to focus on a fresh angle in your story. As you report, the host committee now has a strong sense of like the theme Indianapolis wants to follow when it hosts next year. Tell me, what is it that they're going to try to pursue?
So where Chicago had all this swagger and nostalgia about its celebrities and certainly the basketball aspect of the town, because it does have a rich history with basketball, Indianapolis is really leaning into that, the latter part of that, the basketball history, the nostalgia, all the connections that the Hoosier State has to the sport as a whole. It's really going after that hard, basically trying to make it a love letter to the game and its fans.
I know you talked with is it Rick Fuson?
Yes,
who's the head of the local host committee. That was new information to me. How long have they had that idea?
Really, they've been thinking about it for a while, but the trip to Chicago this past weekend, seeing what Chicago did in infusing its celebrity and big names into the game and into the weekend as a whole, that really helps solidify it for them based on my conversations with Rick and others on the host committee.
So the idea is to weave like a heavy dose of like local basketball flavor or Hoosier basketball flavor through every part of the fan experience.
Right. You saw Chicago weave in, of course, Michael Jordan. You saw Dwayne Wade, who's a native son of the city. You saw Derrick Rose, who played there as a kid as well. All of these people were really highlighted in Chicago's approach to the game. And Indianapolis is really almost taking that as a challenge and saying, we see you, Chicago. Here's what we've got.
That seems like a little bit of a risk to me. Sorry for editorializing quickly. I mean, we have a lot of great players and several connected with the city. There's Larry Bird, obviously, through French Lake. There's Oscar Robertson. You know, the Pacers ABA days are filled with great characters. You know, there are a lot of NBA players currently who have close ties to Indiana or Indianapolis.
Gordon Hayward.
Yep. Eric Gordon, for example, I think went to North Central. But it's going to be hard to beat Chicago when it comes to, the star power.
In talking with Rick Fuson and others with the committee, their goal really isn't to beat Chicago with that. It's to bring a different experience to the fans, to make it more about the sport than about the celebrity of it all. To really focus in on why fans are there, and that's to see some of the best players in the world play and remind them of all the players that came before them that had Indiana connections.
How would that kind of manifest in all the activities that a visitor would see in Indianapolis?
You had tributes from Common, as we heard in the intro. You had performances from some native Chicagoans, and really injected throughout all these events that went on in Chicago, there was that flavor of here's somebody else from Chicago that you forgot was from the city, but they're here tonight. So Indianapolis would probably do something similar to that, but really what it would be is helping fans engage with these individuals. That's not to say that Bob Knight's going to be standing on Monument Circle shaking hands, but really helping people understand, wow, Indianapolis are really steeped in the history of this game, and that's amazing.
Hey, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
The IBJ Podcast is brought to you by Krieg DeVault, a trusted and dynamic law firm representing a wide variety of local, regional, and national clients. Committed to each other and to every client, Krieg DeVault prides itself on integrity, professionalism, respect, and excellence. Financial institutions, global manufacturers, national healthcare providers, and successful organizations of all sizes and market focus rely on Krieg DeVault to create innovative and successful business solutions. Connect today at www.kriegdevault.com.
All right, we're back with the IBJ Podcast. I'm Mason King, and I am with Mickey Shuey, who has written this week about preparations for the NBA All-Star Game next year in Indianapolis. From a viewer's perspective, it seemed like, the telecast of the All-Star Game did a lot of the work in promoting Chicago and its role in hosting the game. Like, we go back to this piece from Common where he, name checks every famous person who ever lived in Chicago for more than 5 minutes. Does the host committee have much influence on the TV production?
My understanding is they don't. That's really more of an NBA thing and the editorial side of TNT, the group that the telecast partner for the NBA for this event. Certainly the host committee may point out to some members of those staffs, like, hey, these are important landmarks in Indianapolis. You may want to get some shots of these, but really it comes down to the discretion of the league and TNT.
So tell me about the contingent from Indianapolis went to Chicago. There were, I think, about 36 and a wide range of people. How did they tackle the event? I assume not as a big group just marching through the streets.
No, so they definitely took a more of a divide and conquer approach to addressing all the questions that they had. They split up into various different groups. You had safety personnel kind of doing their own thing, the heads of IMPD and the Indianapolis Fire Department, as well as Department of Public Works. They were all kind of doing their own thing. And then you had the core Pacers staff and heads of Visit Indy and the Indiana Sports Corp. They really were focused on making sure that the relationship with the league is in a good spot, which it is, and really kind of massaging that and understanding like what the expectations are for the city when it hosts next year, ranging from how events will be organized to where major parties could be held, things like that. And then you had some of the other staff from Pacer Sports Entertainment, including Todd Taylor, who leads their marketing and sales department, kind of focusing on game day operations and what it will look like for the Pacers to host these events next February.
Now, as I'm sure listeners will remember, Bankers Life Fieldhouse will be in the middle of undergoing a major renovation. During this period of time, do they expect any of that work to infringe on the All-Star activities?
No, not at all. In fact, the league is basically making all work on the renovations stop by the time the Pacer season starts next year in order to avoid any potential conflict with the All-Star game. So basically what we've seen from the timeline for the renovations is they've basically gotten underway already to a small degree, and those renovations will pick up in May or whenever the Pacer season concludes, and they'll really go throughout June, July, August, and early September before wrapping up before the start of next Pacer season with Phase 1. And that really will focus on adding 10 more suites to the lower suite level, which will be utilized during the All-Star game, or at least are expected to be utilized. And then a few other fan experience areas, some courtside areas. And then after the All-Star game concludes in February is when they'll kind of do a soft relaunch for Phase 2 of the renovations and go from there with the rest of the renovations, including removing about 25 total suites from the upper levels.
Yeah, while we're on the topic, I think that we all have assumed that there will be a new naming sponsor for the field house in time for the All-Star game, because obviously that would be, by far the biggest media, saturation event that would occur. Is there any indication that the team is ready to announce somebody to take over the Bankers Life name?
So in talking with Todd Taylor late last year, what he told me was that they are planning on making a decision sometime after the end of the first phase, but he did not indicate whether that would actually come before the All-Star game. There is not clear why they haven't actually decided, whether they have actually decided on a sponsor yet, they're just not saying anything, or if they are just holding off until some of this work is done. But the focus for them seems to really be on making sure they're done with what they need to be done with by the time the All-Star game rolls around.
So going back to Chicago, you've had a chance to get back with some of the host committee members and the folks who are from Indianapolis who are in Chicago. What seemed to make the biggest impression on them?
So the biggest impression on them was the way Chicago really engaged with fans, and given the fact that Chicago is such a massive city, there's not just going to be one thing going on like here in Indianapolis when it hosts the All-Star game. Chicago had its auto show going on at the same time, so there was signage throughout for both the All-Star game and the auto show, but the city seemed to really do a good job, the host committee members said, of making it feel like it was the only event in town. As a member of the media who was there, I had a similar experience. I still kind of encountered situations where a few pockets of people may not have known that the All-Star game was going on, but it was also in areas that were not near the arena or the hotels that a lot of fans were staying at. So it was rather understandable if they weren't in town for that event or for an event that was near those facilities that they wouldn't necessarily know.
Were there other areas where they were taking some really copious notes?
They were taking notes in regard to the community engagement with regard to like not-for-profits and other special organizations that the NBA and the local host committee there in Chicago partnered with. Tamika Catchings on the host committee told me that that's an area that they really thought that that they could get a lot of value from in understanding how those relationships were built, how those were carried out. This year, Chicago's All-Star Game introduced a new format for the game in which two charities essentially were competing between Team Giannis and Team LeBron for a pool of, I believe it was $500,000 to raise for their groups, and the winner of each quarter would get a certain amount of money. That seems to be something that Indianapolis is really interested in continuing next year with its own local organizations. Certainly still kind of working through which organizations those could be, but Tamika told me that having that as a model was really helpful for Indianapolis as it turns that corner.
I know you spoke with at least a few people who said that this trip to Chicago wasn't necessarily more valuable than the trip last year they took to Charlotte. Why was that?
Well, simply put, Chicago has a much different layout than Indianapolis. Charlotte's a lot more similar to Indianapolis when it comes to the design of downtown, the proximity of different venues. There was one venue in Charlotte that was a bit further out, Bojangles Arena, which was a secondary venue that was used for Media Day and the celebrity game that people had to drive to. But it still much better mirrored what Indianapolis will do with Bankers Life Fieldhouse and Lucas Oil Stadium and the Convention Center in terms of walkability. In talking with members of the host committee, they viewed Charlotte as much more instructive from that standpoint because of the proximity of all the venues to hotels and things like that.
Gotcha. So one place where Indianapolis really could eat Chicago's lunch is in access, basically.
Oh, absolutely. And Indianapolis knows that. It's really leaning into that people won't have to take Ubers everywhere. I spent $100 on Ubers when I was in town when I couldn't catch shuttles. So it really is playing to those fans who do not want to have to get in the car all the time just to get somewhere or take a shuttle bus somewhere. People who want to be able to engage with the city and really explore it in a way that they may not be able to otherwise. Certainly, if they're going to go to the zoo, that would be a bit of a hike. If they're going to the Children's Museum, they'll probably want to take a car. But to get to the core NBA-related events downtown, they won't have to get in a car.
Right, yeah. The United Center is in the west-west-west loop.
Yes.
I mean, it's essentially not walkable.
Correct. It was about 2 miles from the Media Hotel, which is in the heart of downtown.
Did any members of the Indy contingent express any concerns about something that they saw?
In speaking with members of the host committee, they're ready and raring to go. And they've been ready from a rhetorical standpoint for the past several months to actually get this game going, but they've had to wait for the league to finish up with Chicago. Understandably, it's had its hands tied on that for the past year or so before they could really move the ball and make final decisions on big things. So Indianapolis really used this as an opportunity to button up a few things and make sure that all its ducks were in a row, essentially.
So now that they have the league's attention, they basically have like a 1-year dash to get everything put together. What are the next steps that you think are going to be taken?
So the next steps are definitely going to be firming up their marketing plans for the game, as well as determining exactly how sales will go for the events, and then making a major announcement about their legacy initiative, a $1 million fund that will basically give money to 21 different not-for-profits for capital improvement projects throughout the state related to education or extracurricular activities.
Where's that money coming from?
That money's coming from the Indy Championships Fund, money that's already been raised. And so they made this announcement back in October that they were doing this, so they've been accepting applications for the past several months on that. Each of the organizations will get about $50,000 toward these projects.
So they need to choose who the organizations are. And
my understanding is they've already chosen, but they want to make a big splash of it, so they haven't announced it yet since Chicago just completed its time as host.
And you mentioned that they needed to figure some things out in regards to sales. What did you mean by sales?
So as far as sales go, just how they're going to push tickets, how they're going to actually market the tickets that will be available, who their target audiences will be, things like that.
And was there a sense that Indianapolis could capitalize on maybe an unexpected bump in interest in the All-Star Game due to the success of the Elam ending? And for folks who don't know what we're talking about, this was a new format for ending the game, which is developed by a Ball State professor. Instead of playing at the clock, they play to a certain number, like playing to 21 in your backyard. That seemed like it was really well received. Did anybody mention that as being, something that potentially could drive more interest in the game next year?
Oh, absolutely. I talked to several fans before, during, and after the game about whether they had interest in going to the All-Star game in Indianapolis and in general, and a lot of them cited the Elam ending as a major source of joy as fans who attended the game. They really felt engaged throughout. They stayed until the end, whereas in years past they may have left at halftime to beat traffic. A lot of fans really seemed receptive to that, and not so much the free throw to win it, but because a few fans did point out they didn't like that, but they certainly liked the concept of traditional offense and defense kind of winning out in the All-Star game.
Right on. Well, let's check back maybe in a few months and see how things are going.
Sounds great.
All right, thanks. My thanks again to Mickey. You can check out his story about the All-Star Game planning process in the latest issue of IBJ and at IBJ.com. And before you get on with the rest of your week, I do want to draw your attention to a few other fresh stories. John Russell has a story of dissension in one of central Indiana's wealthiest neighborhoods. Geist Reservoir is in serious need of regular maintenance to clear out weeds and algae, and more than 1,400 households want the state to approve a special taxing district to pay for it. But others opposed the move, saying the taxes would mostly benefit lakefront property owners, not those who live even a few blocks away. Also in this week's paper, Sam Quinn reveals that the state's School for the Deaf and Blind in Indianapolis will need nearly $100 million in upgrades over the next 20 years. This has spurred officials to consider building new schools on the shared site. But some advocates, lawmakers, and alumni worry that the state is motivated by the value of the real estate for the two campuses on the north side, which would be very attractive to developers. And Lindsay Erdotti explores scenarios for the outcome of the investigation into a former Indianapolis gambling company and how two casinos planned for Gary and Terre Haute might be affected. Again, you can find these stories in the latest issue of IBJ, which you, of course, have delivered to your home or office, or online at IBJ.com. And remember, folks, to get full and unfettered access to all of IBJ's award-winning business content, just click the subscribe button. Thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast, which is edited by Leslie Weidenbenner. I'm Mason King, and we'll be back again next week.